It's the end of the year, or at least it was at the time I wrote this script, and so it's time to reflect with my personal Game Awards video. Like the last few years, I'm going to go over my own personal awards to help highlight various titles and how they shine throughout the year. I don't say this with joy, but I've played a decent amount of new games in 2024, but I also struggled to finish many of those, and so some categories like the best narrative might be a little bit scarce. Even with all the new games I've played to varying degrees, I also spent some time with old games, and so inevitably there are some notable omissions like the following. But with all that out of the way, here are my Game Awards for 2024. The first category I like to start off with is the pleasant surprise of the year. Even when trying to keep expectations in check, what game really surprised you with its quality and your overall enjoyment? Indies can often fit well here, but so can AAA games outside your normal wheelhouse. For many, Balatro might perfectly encapsulate this sentiment and still has me looking over with curiosity. Still Wakes the Deep is a first-person narrative horror game that wouldn't normally be something I would be into, but somewhat similar to Bramble the Mountain King, I was compelled to see it through to the very end. Dragon's Dogma 2 was actually a game I didn't finish this year, but I had a lot of fun with the time I had with it. The companions in particular were the main source of most of the fun and over-the-top chaos. If it weren't for some small but impactful structural issues I had, I probably would have loved the game. My pick this year is easily Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. I played a little bit of Sands of Time a long time ago, but have no real attachment to this franchise. I also am not a huge Metroidvania fan. For every Metroidvania I like, I feel there are usually 4 or 5 I don't. Yet somehow Prince of Persia and The Lost Crown was a blast and easily one of my favorite games this year. The core platforming is precise and at times methodical, while the combat was some of the best I've experienced in a 2D side-scroller. The over-the-top animations were a nice visual delight that felt appropriately epic for gods battling it out. The only real complaint I had was how lengthy the boss battles were, while also being hard. I don't mind the hard part so much, but when they go on forever and ever, I find it can often get a little stale, but that could just be me. But that does bring up a positive, and that's that there's a ton of customization in various elements of difficulty and accessibility. This helped me find the right sweet spot of challenge yet forgiving. I played The Lost Crown on Switch and it looked great there, but is also available on just about everything, so if you haven't, I would highly recommend checking it out. While I give out the pleasant surprise of the year, I also have to crown the biggest disappointment. As I say every year, this isn't the worst game I played, but rather the one that let me down the most. Rise of the Ronin is a good example, being fun but rather basic and unremarkable in a lot of ways, especially for having the PlayStation Studios banner in front of it. Pacific Drive is a game that felt like what was advertised was a bit different than what I got. Helldivers 2 was okay with strangers, but not nearly as fun as with friends, and so the fact that I struggled to get my one friend with the game to play online somewhat soured my overall experience. Life is Strange Double Exposure disappointed because it's not as good as the other games, yet if I'm being honest, I still did enjoy the journey even if I wasn't a fan of the destination. Maybe surprising to some since I haven't mentioned this game on my channel, but my biggest disappointment this year based on what I did experience versus what I was hoping for would have to be Pacific Drive. I guess a classic example of projecting what I wanted the game to be versus what the game actually was. I had seen several trailers giving off the vibes of a narrative first-person mystery game that reminded me of something like Firewatch, but as time went on it seemed that there were more crafting and customization elements, which did seem promising in their own way. Yet personally I feel that the final product was way more tedium and numbers driven than I would have hoped for. There's a survival crafting aspect that is quickly diluted the further you get because resources are pretty abundant. The janky crafty elements feel at odds with the smoothness presented with the narrative and driving gameplay, which is a shame because the driving felt fantastic, especially with the DualSense. The more immersive elements were interrupted way too much, with the story quickly being thrown to the wayside. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you had a chance to play it, but I was disappointed with Pacific Drive. What was the best multiplayer party game of 2024? Call of Duty is always a good contender, and even though I played through some of the campaign, I didn't get a chance to play online against friends or strangers, which is kind of funny considering it's the one multiplayer game almost all of my friends have. If you're into strategy games, or you're specifically like me into Age of Empires, Age of Mythology Retold is a great time online. A bit more moment-to-moment fun would have to be both Dragon Ball Sparking Zero and Tekken 8, which were the two that I narrowed down this category to. Sparking Zero has a unique element of chaotic fun when playing against someone locally who knows a little bit about the series or the games. Tekken 8 is more balanced, and so competitively against strangers it's the superior title, but Sparking Zero's fan service does add an extra layer of fun for fans of the series. I played some rounds of Sparking Zero against my little brother in person, which were a blast, while also playing quite a bit of Tekken 8 with my wife, which was also fun. Both are fun locally and online, but Tekken 8 takes this category for being more balanced online while also being optimized for local play. Tekken 8 is the perfect game to play for countless hours into the late night against friends and loved ones. The character variety mixes up each dynamic enough to keep things feeling fresh for a long time. I haven't played the DLC, but it appears that this title has great long-term support. I think the hardest category for me to pick this year was the best soundtrack. I feel a lot of composers nailed the assignment this year for making perfect melodies for their respective games. For example, Tekken 8's retro modern arcadey music is perfect for a fighting game. Many of the tracks are great at building up anticipation into an all-out battle. Another great contender would be Sonic X Shadow Generations with its pure pedal-to-the-metal approach. Astrobot probably has by far the most earwormy music this year. I still have that campsite song playing in my head on repeat. Prince of Persia and The Lost Crown had one of the most unique soundtracks this year, a beautiful mix of cinematics with some rock and metal. Culturally, you also get a blend of various sounds throughout the world all meshed together. The Lost Crown nails delivering the right energy level for the appropriate moment. Unsurprisingly, making music for games is hard, and with that, sometimes matching the right mood or intensity on screen can be inconsistent or off target, which is an area where The Lost Crown shines, as does Astrobot. For this year, I'm going to go with Astrobot. I wouldn't necessarily jam out to Astro's soundtrack in the car on its own, but I think it's the best game this year to perfectly match and enhance the mood of the art direction. Every course's soundtrack fits like a glove for the mood and atmosphere it's going for. Mix that with the easy but catchy tunes, and I feel Astrobot has the best soundtrack this year, with plenty of close runner-ups. The next award is up there as one of the most subjective, which is saying something considering these are all subjective categories, and that's the best visuals. Most of us can appreciate and be in awe of hyper-realistic details that border on reality, but it's also easy to nitpick games like that because even the best looking games don't look quite one-to-one with the movies or real life. In the past, I have personally leaned more towards clean and stylized visuals over lifelike. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is still by far one of the most visually impressive titles I've ever played, but like every year, there have been quite a few stunners in 2024. The Plucky Squire gets a lot of points for style and a very unique package. Few games have that level of visual variety. On the opposite end, Senua's Saga Hellblade 2 gets pretty damn close to watching a movie with the most detailed pebbles you'll ever see. It also kind of plays like a movie too. Based on a beloved movie franchise, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle was also mighty impressive with the best in-game Harrison Ford model I've ever seen. Also based on an old IP from the 80s, Dragon Ball Sparking Zero is easily the best looking 3D arena fighter I've played to date. Astrobot was the final game I really considered because, somewhat similar to Ratchet & Clank, the visuals are just so clean. Smooth frame rate, rounded edges, vibrant but balanced colors. It's one of the few games you don't need to use imagination to clean up those rough edges. Along with Astrobot, the other two games I super considered out of the ones mentioned were Dragon Ball Sparking Zero and Indiana Jones, and out of the three, I'm going with Sparking Zero. Perhaps the unconventional choice, but it just feels right. I've put in well over 100 hours at this point, and I still find myself admiring the cutscenes or even just the auras. Compared to all the other Dragon Ball games, nothing is on the same level visually except Fighter Z, which makes Sparking Zero all the more impressive considering it's in a 3D space. The developers nailed every angle of these character models, and most of the supers and transformations are top tier recreations as well. Even smaller things like particle effects and character damage are, for lack of a better term, Super Saiyan immersive. The stages themselves look good but not as hyper detailed as the models, but the destructibility is next level. With so many great looking games in 2024, what title stood out to you the most in this department? Next we have the best narrative, which was probably tied with music as my hardest category to pick. At the end of last December, after making my Game Awards video, I started playing Jedi Survivor and really enjoyed that story. I could feel some of the DNA of the original trilogy inside of it. Even though I completed it in January, it came out the prior year, and so it's not eligible, but I wanted to give it a shout out since I didn't get a chance to sing its praises last year. So far, I am really enjoying Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, but I haven't finished it, so we'll have to exclude it here. Sandland was an underrated adaptation, and I think way more people would enjoy it, especially the story if they gave it a try. Prince of Persia and the Last Crown was also a bit underrated with a quality story, but out of all the games I played to completion that had any form of a real narrative to begin with, my favorite would have to be Still Wakes the Deep. As I mentioned earlier, this game didn't immediately stand out to me, but once I hit play, the story sank its hooks into me pretty quickly. The acting across the board, but especially with the protagonist, Kaz McCleary, was fantastic. Throughout the events of the game, things go very wrong very quickly, pushing Kaz and the people around him to their very limits. The isolated setting of a 1970s oil rig in the middle of the ocean with some supernatural elements is a recipe for all sorts of phobias. Even though Still Wakes the Deep is scary, I also found it to be narratively engaging. The characters were well written and performed, especially for the length of the game, to the point where some deaths genuinely bummed me out. I'm not 100% sure if I liked the ending, but at the very minimum, it was impactful. Still Wakes the Deep has great characters, an interesting conflict, and an immersive setting, and so if you have Game Pass, I think it's an easy recommendation. The second to last category is a category I put a lot of value in that I don't really see talked about that much by others, and that's the atmosphere or in-game world. Of course, the audio and especially visuals contribute towards the atmosphere, but what game location impressed the most as a living, breathing place, even if it's technically dead? Being based on the creative works of the legendary Akira Toriyama, both Dragon Ball Sparking Zero and Sandland do a great job of capturing the essence of their respective properties. Sparking Zero focuses more on the action side of things, so there's not a whole lot of world building going on there. Sandland does do a pretty good job of representing the entirety of its source material with even some new additions, being essentially a sequel to Journey to the West, which funny enough was some of the initial inspiration for Dragon Ball. Black Myth Wukong feels like a fully realized place with a ton of its own history. The annoyingly restrictive invisible walls can take you out of that world and atmosphere, but overall the creativity and enemies and locations really play well off of each other. On the flip side of a land full of over-the-top fantasy is Still Wakes the Deep, which felt like a real time and place I've visited, but I've never actually been to. But none of those games are the winner because I'm going with Nobody Wants to Die. It seems like nobody I know has heard of this game, but it's my favorite in-game location this year. Take a classic noir film and throw it into 2329 New York and you have Nobody Wants to Die. It's definitely a noir first, but the futuristic sci-fi elements add to this title's unique feel. The art direction and music hits the perfect spot to put you into the shoes of a damaged and down on his luck detective trying to uncover a much deeper and sinister crime. There's an interesting mix of classic sci-fi tropes like flying cars with more novel yet disturbing believable things like the capitalistic distribution of human bodies and overall life expectancy. A little grim, I know. This world isn't perfect. In fact, in many ways it's worse than the one we have now, which serves as great material for the controversies and cynical world building needed for that great detective noir. Even though it was mostly an on-rails type of experience, I just absolutely love the unique setting and how it perfectly got me into the right mindset for the mystery and the narrative that unfolded. The final category is the Most Fun Award. I quickly narrowed this down to 4 nominees that all felt worthy of this category. Prince of Persia and the Last Crown was such a delightfully complete package that was fun in every aspect. A lot of Metroidvanias have clear weaknesses like less refined platforming or amazing platforming but with combat that felt like an afterthought. But The Lost Crown is amazing in just about every category, and so I maintained a constant level of fun throughout. Tekken 8 is another great example of minute-to-minute fun. In its very nature, there's little to no downtime to ever get bored or lost in. Tekken 8 is a perfect example of a game that's easy to pick up and play with immediate fun to be had. Getting better only enhances the fun without needing to rely on it to have a great time. Also a fighting game but of a different flavor is Dragon Ball Sparking Zero. Sparking Zero isn't as competitively balanced and refined as Tekken, but its utilization of omnidirectional movement is severely underrated and exciting. Once you get down the basics, the marriage of gameplay and presentation are just next level fun. Transforming mid-battle isn't super practical or important, but it's awesome, as is blowing up half the stage or blasting your opponent through a mountainside. Getting the better of back and forth exchanges mixed in with over-the-top special moves and transformations just never get old. The last nominee is Astro, which, similar to Dragon Ball but in several different ways, seems to have the mission statement of let's make fun the #1 priority. Platforming is fun, the enemies are fun, the power-ups are fun, collecting robots is fun, the environments are fun, even the gacha machine is fun. One of the best parts is that there is no fat to the experience to be found. I didn't feel a single second of my time was ever wasted. So who is the winner? It really came down to quality versus quantity. I love Tekken 8 and Prince of Persia, but for me it came down to Dragon Ball and Astro. Sparking Zero is the game I put the most hours into this year with always something to do, but Astro gave me the most fun per minute this year, and by that logic, I'm giving this category to Astro. Team Asobi managed to create one of the best 3D platformers in years, which is kind of why I was surprised that people were surprised that Astro won at the Game Awards. Seemed to be one of those tell me you haven't played a game without telling me kind of moments. I mean, granted, I haven't finished or even played every nominee this year, but Astro always seemed like the clear frontrunner, with probably Metaphor in second. Neither here nor there, Astro gave me personally the most fun per minute this year, with a smile on my face the entire time. Not that I'm a video a day kind of guy or anything, but I do apologize for the lack of content recently. I've been personally very busy, leaving me a bit creatively drained. Work's been mentally demanding. I had some good personal news, I had some bad news, I had a couple medical scares throughout the family. My computer's hard drive started to go out, and then I wrote and recorded a whole video and then had second thoughts, and now I'm getting this video out late, but it is what it is. Like last year, I conducted a series of polls to help decide my audience's favorite game of 2024. Here are the top 6, with Dragon Ball Sparking Zero in first place. Astro came in at a strong second, while Metaphor, Sonic, Helldivers, and Dragon's Dogma were also some of your favorite games this year, or last year I should say. As always, the initial placement can make a big difference on who ends up as the final 6, but I feel pretty confident most of these would have made it. Regardless, for sure the top 2 would have been a lock. As always, I appreciate you for watching, and until next time, see ya.